You can start.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Maraj, Research Fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Istanbul Sabathi and Zain University. We welcome all of you to our 40th book discussion. Today, we are honored to host Professor Ayse Zarakol to talk about her key interventionist monograph, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. Ayse is a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge, where she also has an appointment as a politics fellow at Emmanuel College. Professor Ayse grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and moved to the US to attend Middlebury College. And then she went on to finish her master's and PhD degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Talking about her work, which is quite fascinating, Zarakol's research is at the intersection of international relations and historical sociology, focusing on East-West relations in the international system, history and future of world orders, conceptualizations of modernity and sovereignty, rising and declining powers, and Turkish politics in a comparative perspective. She has written some key interventionist monographs like Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, After the Defeat, How the West Learned to Live with the West, and the editor of the prize-winning Hierarchies in World Politics. Her articles have appeared in journals such as International Organization, International Theory, International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Relations, and the Review of International Studies, among others. Before I invite Professor Ayse to talk about her key text and very important monograph, I would like to put her work in a larger context. As we know that it's very important to understand that a lot of work has been published on political theory, on world order, on international relations. But we also know that the main discourse on political theory and international relations in academia is dominated by the Western universalist paradigm, which traces its origin in the Westphalian model. And also so much of the work in the fields have traditionally focused only on Europe and the European trajectory. But we have also observed a huge shift in past 2 decades to a work which has come out to question this linear scholarship. A lot of scholars in the field of international relations, research have started using a non-Eurocentric and decolonial approaches by analyzing, for example, different historical international systems, societies, and orders beyond Europe, as well as the agency of non-Western polities in constituting world politics. So this is where the work of Ayse falls, wherein she tries to come up with some comparisons outside of Europe, or the European model, or the Eurocentric model. How, as she herself writes, how the story of global order and sovereignty unfolded elsewhere before this, as I use the word, salvational universalist Westphalian nation-state model. So this is where I placed her work when I read her book. So I request Professor Ayse to talk about her work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you, even if via Zoom. The book has been out for over a year now, and I've been speaking to many different audiences around the world, sometimes in person, sometimes over Zoom, and every audience I speak to seems to have slightly different questions. So I really welcome the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the book. So what I will do now is to explain what I was trying to do in the book in more general terms. I assume not everybody in the audience is an international relations scholar, so maybe I'll set the scene in that way, then give an overview of the main arguments in the book, both historical and theoretical. And then that should take maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. And after that, I hope we can have a more general discussion, depending on the parts of the book that you find interesting. So that's kind of my plan. I hope that works for everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And oops, sorry, that's the wrong. My apologies. I had the right here. Okay. Can you see that? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so yes, here's the book, Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders. as noted out from Cambridge University Press in 2022 in hardback, paperback, and also as ebook. So one of my goals in the book is to change the understanding of history, international relations generally operates with as a global discipline. I mean, of course, international relations is a global discipline. It has become, it's studied everywhere, but as noted by Merhaj, it's US centric, it's Western centric, it has a particular history that it operates with. So, if you pick up a textbook, international relations textbook, the history that you will get will be something like, there was the Peloponnesian War, in ancient Greece, Sparta, Athens, that competition. So a long time ago. Then nothing happens until 1648, which is the conclusion to the 30 Years' War in Europe. And that's the Peace of Westphalia, a set of treaties that are considered to have created the modern international order. And in fact, sometimes the modern international order is called the Westphalian order for that reason. So we jump to 17th century, and then there are a number of key events, like the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, end of Cold War, maybe 9/11 could make it there, but so it's kind of like a schematic view of history that's focused really in Europe, on the West. The rest of the world doesn't come into the view until 19th century, 20th century as a site for Western action or colonialism. And when it comes to this part, all 2,000 years, the assumption, there's complete silence about it. Maybe sometimes Rome is mentioned, but rarely. The assumption is that nothing of importance to international relations happened anywhere in the world until European actors created the Westphalian order. So if you study international order, the history of international order, if this is one of your interests, then the assumption that you have as a student is that there was no order that was international or global anywhere until Europe created a regional order in 17th century and then exported it to the rest of the world. And in recent years, this account has been challenged by critical scholars and post-colonial scholars, but sometimes they also, they normatively challenge it. They say, the old story used to be Europeans civilized the world, and the new critical story is no, they didn't, but they still ordered the world. So we concede agency only to Europe and Westerners. So I wanted to kind of get away from that. Maybe there were other ordering projects previously, and if you operate with this general understanding of history, when you think about the rest of the world, you assume, again, as a student, that the rest of the world was in silos that resemble present-day regional or national or cultural divisions, as if like China has always existed, India has always existed, Turkey has always existed. And these parts of the world were connected to each other only after the creation of the modern international order. And before that, they didn't really have connections or trade or intellectual exchange or, or even conflict. It's only Europeans that put the world together. Why does that matter? Like, why is it problematic to work with these assumptions? Of course, it gets the history wrong, as I will argue. But it also matters for international relations, which is a contemporary-oriented discipline. The history matters because we comment on what's happening now in the world based on our understanding of history. We drive our theories in international relations from studying history. So if you have an incomplete understanding of history or an erroneous understanding of history, or if you think only Europeans had agency, that's likely to distort your present day thinking. So, for instance, when we debate what's happening in Ukraine, you might have seen John Mearsheimer in the news. He's a famous IR scholar who comments a lot about this issue. He works on great powers. He's a realist. But all of his assumptions about how great powers act come from having studied what he thinks are a limited set of great powers that have ever existed in history, right? So it's possible that he's drawing the wrong conclusions and wrong generalizations because he doesn't know what else has happened. Or, famously, Thucydides' trap, again in the news a lot, if you're following the competition between China and the US, this is the idea that as China rises, there will be conflict between, US and China, which is based on what people see are the lessons of the Athens-Sparta competition that Thucydides discussed in his book Peloponnesian War. So again, studying one episode in history lead people to make very strong arguments about what's happening in the present. So all I'm saying is, maybe if we have a fuller understanding of history, we wouldn't be so quick to generalize, or maybe we would generalize, but we would have better generalizations about what is happening in the present. So this is one of my primary goals in this book, a new history for international relations. Of course, I don't mean to claim here, because I'm also focusing on a limited time, a particular place. I'm not claiming that this is it. My book is the the final word. I'm just saying it's a step in the right direction. So I'm going to tell you about 13th to 17th century Eurasia. There are many other orders, many other historical periods that international relations could study and learn from, whether, in the area that we call the Middle East today, or Africa, or the Americas. There are so many time periods and geographies that are completely unknown to international relations that we would be much better served educating ourselves about. Okay, so what I wanted to do in the book is to get away from Eurocentrism for the reasons that I discussed. And, in recent years, there's been an effort in international relations to do exactly that. But often what happens is a particular region or country comes in almost as an island. So like there are a lot of works in recent years about China and the tributary system, for instance. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to get away from Eurocentrism, but I still wanted to write kind of a grand history. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting, if I wrote a history that was focused on what we call the East today, or Asia, or Eurasia. I mean, the terms are problematic and themselves Eurocentric, so that's why I'm putting scare quotes around them. But I thought, I'll write a history of Asia, Eurasia for international relations that does not center European actors, but centers the actors that were there. And if you want to do that, if that's your goal, a good place to start, of course, you could go much further back. Yeah. But a good place to start is the 13th century with the Mongol Empire, or the Empire of Genghis Khan, as I call it, because it wasn't really an ethnic or national empire. And in the book, I argue that this empire played a role for the space that we call Asia, similar to the role that the Roman empires plays for European history. It's a moment of convergence of faiths for people all around this area, from modern-day China to modern-day Turkey. They come under the control of the same ruler, the same sovereign. Of course, the conquests, the Mongol conquests are, extremely brutal and violent. I don't talk much about that in the book because I'm trying to focus on something else, but I do want to underline I'm not trying to whitewash or apologize for the Mongol conquests. But this is a moment where there's a shared experience across the continent. And as all empires do, European empires have had lasting legacies and influences to the present day. We talk about, post-colonial experience. It's true of all their empires as well. So the Mongol Empire, having ruled over this space for, over a century and more, has lasting legacies because it, unifies this area, and it disseminates understanding, institutions, practices across the area that it rules. I mean, how do we know this? In the book, I discuss the experience of, kind of as anecdotally, experience of travelers. Travel becomes easy, relatively easy in the 13th century and the 14th century. Why? Because this is a unified space, where there's so much convergence. Travel is relatively easy in our modern world because there's been, globalization. We have a lot that we share that's common, that's been standardized, also due to capitalism, etc. But it's those moments that people find it easy to go from here to there. Of course, most people today know about Marco Polo, and I think in the West they think of Marco Polo as somebody who went to space, or like Mars, like somebody going somewhere that nobody had ever gone before. But the reality is Marco Polo was traveling a well-connected route that was made possible by the backdrop of these conquests and the empire. Another example I discuss in the book, I think even a better example, is Ibn Battuta, who was an Islamic jurist who starts his life in Western North Africa, and then travels for decades across Asia, going all the way to China, we think. And then comes back and writes his memoirs. And you can read them. They're very interesting. And what's remarkable when you read his memoirs is he never encounters that much difficulty. Of course, he's like an elite person in this world with means, etc. But his profession, is recognizable to the places that he goes. He has social capital that travels. And the people that he encounters, his sponsors in various cities and so on, they ask him for news of where he came from, but they're not hearing. It's very clear that they're not hearing of that place for the first time. It's a connected world where they're getting updates from travelers. So I'm arguing that the backdrop is the convergence, the connectedness made possible by the empire. Of course, there are other factors, but the main point is this is a connected world of shared experiences, a world order, to use the language of my book. And those shared things are, it could be anything from materials and goods, that go from one end of the empire, one end of the world order. I mean, in my understanding, the world order is bigger than the empire because empire making has knock-on effects, and tentacles outside of outside of the empire. But yeah, so a good example of what was disseminated in this period is the dumpling. We different places have different names, but even today, cultures that have this item in their cuisine, we can go back to the 13th century and see that they were either ruled by the Mongols or were tapped into this order created by the Mongols. There are other examples. For instance, effects on you might know effects on Islamic arts. Sometimes scholars call this the Chingizid exchange, like similar to the Colombian exchange, because they took so much from East Asia and brought it to West Asia, and to some extent vice versa, that the world was changed, like really significantly changed in terms of art, culture, food, etc. in this period. But of course, in the book, I'm not interested in those. I mean, I'm just like talking about them now because it's interesting. In the book, what I'm interested in, because my focus is on order making and rule, what I want to show is that this empire disseminated a particular understanding of sovereignty and order across Asia, the legacy of which we can actually trace for years, decades, centuries to come. I call that in the book a Chingizid sovereignty or Chingizid sovereignty model. Not because Genghis Khan invented it, just like to give it a name. I'm calling it. It was associated with him after this period. So this is a understanding of sovereignty where all the authority, including lawmaking authority, is held by the ruler, and not because really he's he has divine sanction. I mean, it's we can get into that. It's complicated, but really because he's a world conqueror, right? He's all powerful because empirically he's all powerful. So there's an expectation in this model that there will be conquest, never-ending conquest. At the same time, the ruler is the lawgiver and is not really accountable to anybody, to any religious authority, for instance, and is the ultimate lawgiver. That's the model. Now, this is because it comes up in some of my book talks. Let me anticipate an objection that you may have. This is an understanding of sovereignty that we find in late antiquity. So it's more frequent if you go 1,000+ more years back. But then, with the advent of especially monotheism in West Asia, right? It's checked. You of course you have rulers kind of trying this, but they are always checked by the authority of the church, the ulama, etc. Right, in different settings. So what I think the Mongol Empire, the success of the Mongol Empire does, is bring back this older, earlier model, understanding of sovereignty, of rule, that one person can be so powerful in this world, and then articulate a very successful justification or legitimation for it, which is world empire. And because Genghis Khan is so successful, he almost conquers all of the known world at the time. They go all the way to Europe. Then that really breathes life into this understanding, and then the model becomes something that inspires centralizing rulers for generations. They copy him and they imitate him. Now, from an international relations perspective, this is interesting to us because of this interest in world empire, world conquest. This is essentially a universalizing vision, a universalizing understanding of, politics. So that makes us somewhat comparable to the modern international order, which has its own different but own universalizing vision and understanding. Of course, we're not talking about nation states or even nations at this time. The actors that I study in the book, I call them houses or great houses. It's, the power and competition is really between these powerful houses. So the Genghis Khan's family is one such house, but there are others that I'll get to. And I think, there's, maybe we can't call them great powers, but they are comparable to the great powers of our day. Okay, so that's kind of the general argument. And what I'm doing in the book is to trace this particular understanding of sovereignty and the order that it creates, because they are all chasing world empire across subsequent centuries. So in chapter 2, I look at the original world order created by this particular understanding of sovereignty and universal empire, which is the world empire of Genghis Khan. And then that breaks into 4 pieces. So you can see here, they have different names in historiography, but they were essentially, the same thing. The Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, Chagatai Ulus, and the Yuan dynasty, which has been Sinicized, but really they were, very much part of this world order. I can get into the details if anybody's interested in that. Then, that world order fragments and collapses and is quickly replaced by another world order, this time not created by Chingizids, but 2 houses that have been greatly influenced by their experience under the rule of the Chingizids. So in West Asia, we have the Timurids. Very easy to demonstrate in their case, especially because Timur, or Tamerlane, as he's sometimes called, deliberately fashioned himself after Genghis Khan and very clearly copied him, and in fact died on his way to trying to conquer China. How the Timurids were operating by this understanding of Chingizid sovereignty, although of course by this point, they've converted to, first the Chingizids, some branches converted to Islam, and the Timurids are also Muslim, but it's a hybridized form of this understanding of sovereignty. Again, we can discuss. And on East Asia, in East Asia, you have the Ming, who are not Mongol or anything, but they are definitely influenced by their experience under Yuan control. So they don't act like the early Ming emperors, do not act anything like traditional Chinese rulers. They're much more centralizing, much more interested in world recognition. They are the ones who send out the treasure voyages and emissaries into Inner Asia. They're not really in the beginning accountable to, the bureaucracy, etc. So they are the early Ming are also, as I call them, Chingizid sovereigns. And there's the second world order created by this understanding, which fragments in the middle of 15th century. And then, perhaps more interestingly, for an audience based in Istanbul, In chapter 4, I discuss a third world order that rises after the Timurid Ming order fragments, and that's the one that is constructed by the competition between the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and to some extent the Uzbeks. I don't talk about the Uzbeks, the Shaybanids as much because I didn't have enough sources to work with, but they really should be in there. These are the houses that gain ascendancy in the wake of the Timurid fragmentation and collapse. And, contrary to traditional IR accounts that look at the 16th century and see an ascendant Europe, what I argue in the book is that if you lived in the 16th century, first of all, if you were a person in the 16th century, the odds were you were a subject of one of these houses, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, a third of the population, world's population at the time. Much of the world's economy was controlled by these houses. And essentially, like, the world was ordered and centered from West Asia at this point. Of course, we call these, sometimes they're called gunpowder empires, sometimes they're called Islamic empires. It's not that I'm against those characterizations, but what I want to emphasize in the book is that they are also Chinggisid sovereigns, or post-Chinggisid or post-Timurid sovereigns. The rulers of these houses, especially in the 16th century, claim so much power. It's all, from an Islamic perspective, it's a bit unorthodox, and again, we can discuss. So you can definitely see the influences of the previous world orders and this particular understanding of sovereignty in this period on these houses. And then on chapter 5, I discuss how this particular understanding of sovereignty influenced other parts of the world in the 16th century. Moscow is a very good example because Moscow was under the control of the Mongols for a long period. The Habsburgs were definitely, I would argue, were influenced by this as well via their competition with the Ottomans. And the late Ming are still displaying some of the influence. All of that is to say, in the 16th century, the world was still being ordered by ideas and modes of governance that came out of the East very clearly, rather than Europe. So that's kind of the account. The main point is that here is, from an IR perspective, the argument is that order making doesn't start with Europe or Westphalia. There were other orders before. This one, again, I'm emphasizing one type of order. There are yet others. So in these chapters, I have my eye out for this particular understanding of sovereignty and how it influenced the primary actors. And you can see a lot of secondary institutions that attached to this particular understanding of sovereignty, an interest in astrology, astronomy, hunting gardens, general relaxed attitude towards, I call it cultural pluralism, but because these ruling families see themselves so above the general population, they are generally not so interested, especially when they are at times when they're more influenced by Chinggisid sovereignty rather than other ways of looking at the world. They're not so interested in the daily cultural practices of their subjects. They don't really care. Trade, promotion of trade, and tenestry, which is a particular way of selecting the successors. So it's not necessarily the oldest son, but it's fighting it out. And I have many examples in the book I think it selects for a conqueror. If you can conquer your own family, then odds are that you will be a conquering ruler. So that's what I'm looking at, and I trace this model. So again, of course, the model changes. It hybridizes, as I said. It converges with Islam or Buddhism and whatnot. So it takes on other features. But just as when we talk about Westphalian sovereignty, we can see a continuity. I mean, from 19th century to the present, there's been changes in the understanding of the nation states, etc. But there is a continuity, right? So there is a continuity in the orders that I'm looking at. And by doing that, I'm able to fill out this empty space, with other orders and other competitions that international relations can study. It's not the great empty space anymore, but there are other orders we can look at. So let me now come to that's the general contours of the historical narrative. Let me come to the issue of what are the benefits of expanding IR's historical knowledge. I started with this in the introduction. We can essentially, we can theorize better. If we know more history, we can theorize better. I mean, that's always my point. So international relations is very interested in the question of decline, rise and decline, but thus far has only studied really great powers, great powers rise and decline. That's because international relations really looks at European history from 17th century onwards. So it seems like nothing really changes except the identity of the great powers. Like the great powers always share the same understanding of order. The rules of the game don't really change. But what I'm saying in this book is actually that takes the background for granted, but the background itself can change. So what I'm arguing is that orders can also decline, they can fragment, they can be replaced. I mean, of course, now international relations is aware of this because recently we've been talking about the crisis of the liberal international order. But until recently, there was no expectation of that, right? It was end of history. It's just going to get, the order that we have is here. It's just going to get expanded and so on. But when you look at history, you can see real order fragmentation that's separate from the identity of great power competition. And the other thing that I talk about in the book is, there's a level above orders, above international orders or world orders, which I call ecumene. It's something like civilization, but I didn't want to use the word civilization. It has too much baggage. Some deep norms that underwrite orders and make them connected to each other. So I gave the example of 19th century to the present. Of course, the order has changed. There was the Cold War order, then the liberal international order, before that the European colonial order. But the deep norms underwriting those orders about territory, about borders, about citizenship, etc., like those things that we take for granted, they've remained relatively the relationship between politics and religion, etc. Those things have remained relatively constant, so much so that most people don't even think about that, about the fact that there are nations. But for many centuries, or for much of history, there were really no nations, right? So the deep norms can themselves change. So in the Chingizid ecumene, as it might be called, everybody's trying to conquer China, connect to China, right? It's like the big prize, right? So, or there is territory is important, but not a very different understanding of territoriality. The very deep norms are different. So what those people took for granted, we completely forgot. And what we take for granted can similarly unravel and, may become meaningless, a century, 2 centuries, or 3 centuries from now. That's the point that I'm trying to make. The other, thing that I think my book draws attention to is the importance of, what I call structural crises in terms of, the damage that they do to orders. Again, international relations thinks that, as a discipline, has assumed that international change only happens as a result of, agency of great powers. United States does this, or Russia does that, etc. But when you take the long macro historical view, often, or at least in the past, maybe this is no longer true. I mean, it's something to debate, but the orders that I studied did not fragment so much because this person or this empire did this, but it was more about big structural pressures that affected all of the actors in the order, in the system. So I discuss a short period of crisis in the 14th century, a short period of crisis in the mid 15th century, and a very long period of crisis in the 17th century, really, for pretty much most of 17th century, which historians sometimes call the general crisis of the 17th century, as being particularly detrimental to the orders that I study. And I'm happy to, again, talk about that. But, some examples of, the causes of these crises. So if we're talking about the 14th century crisis, the plague, the Black Death, is one of the factors, ending a number of dynasties, creating disruption. But then, it doesn't, it's not a very sustained disruption. So the order reconstitutes itself in relatively similar terms. There are other, it's not just the plague, there are other factors as well. Mid 15th century, there's trade disruption, there is shortage of coins, that seems to affect all of Asia. And general crisis of the 17th century, again, many different causes have been kind of offered for this. Lately, historians think it was climate change because it was a particularly cold period in the northern hemisphere. So what ends up happening is food shortages, violent storms, and it's not that the climate change or whatever is the cause for the disruption of order, but these pressures end up creating wars and rebellions, and overland trade becomes very difficult. Within the, for instance, Ottoman Empire, you have the Celali rebellions in this period. In Europe, you have the 30 Years' War. And what I argue in the book is that it's not so much of the conflict, but the turning inward that fragments the order. Everybody is kind of dealing with their own problems. So order is not maintained through either competition or cooperation, because there is this turn inward. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's, again, if you're interested in these questions of disorder or decline, I think, this type of macro grand history is very helpful to think with. Finally, I have an epilogue in the book where I discuss whether I'm a Eurasianist, and I just didn't want to come across as I said, like, making an apology for one empire project over another. And in the epilogue, I discuss, the politics of both the disciplinary and the real world politics of writing such a grand history as I have done. And I'll say just one word about each. I mean, the disciplinary politics of macro history, I thought I needed a defense here because, in international relations, especially because we don't want to be Eurocentric, we've tried to get away from grand narratives because they were Eurocentric. And my argument there is you can't just say, existing narratives are Eurocentric, we won't do them anymore, because if you don't replace them with alternatives, they live on, like the zombie of that grand narrative lives on, because everybody needs, even if they're doing micro work, they need something, they need to know what they're doing, how that relates to the larger whole. So there needs to be some kind of grand narrative. So my argument is that we have to come up with alternatives. Those of us who complain about Eurocentrism, we cannot just complain, we have to provide alternatives that people can work with and use. And in terms of the politics of, the real world politics of macro history, I am not trying to, apologize for violent conquests or centralized rule or autocracy, but it is a fact. This is a part of history. What I'm trying to emphasize is the shared experience of so much of Eurasia, Asia. It was a real, learning experience for me. My background is in Turkey, as you know, to know that, at one point, so much of Asia was under the control or was being influenced by the same experiences. And I think that's something, Europe emphasizes. So much of European identity is about that, shared historical experience. And why not develop, similar narratives about other parts of the world instead of just relying on present day, like, national or religious divisions to create unity. So that's the real world politics part of it. And I think I'll stop there and open to questions. I don't know, I lost track of time, but hopefully that's about the right amount.
That was exactly.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for this beautiful and insightful presentation. I would say that this has been one of the best presentations we have had so far. Thank you so much. So while you were talking about your presentation and about this book, I was writing down and thinking, what should I ask in terms of what I already perceived while reading your book. So you beautifully talked about this idea of change in terms of order in the pre-modern and the modern world. And you also talk about this notion of ecumen. So I was wondering if you can unpack and throw some light on the philosophical underpinnings of West as a global order and how it shapes and influences the notion of authority and political order in the contemporary world. And to add further, what are the markers of differentiation between the contemporary great houses, which you mentioned as you use the word great houses? What are the markers of differentiation between the contemporary great houses that run the global order in comparison to the great houses of the pre-modern world? And also, is it possible to imagine an order outside the Westphalian nation-state order?
Okay.
These are 3 questions.
So that's a lot. So let me just make sure that I get
that.
Yes. So the first is the philosophical underpinnings of
West as a global order, and how it shapes and influences the notion of authority in the contemporary, in the political of the contemporary world.
Okay, and then the second is
and what are the markers of differentiation? Differentiation between the contemporary great houses that run the global order in comparison to the great houses in the pre-modern world.
Okay.
And third, is it possible to imagine an order outside the Westphalian order?
Okay. Yes. Great. Yeah. So those are like really big questions, but let me try to give some quick responses. So my earlier work was more about this notion of the West and how it orders the modern international order, and the hierarchies that kind of underwrite it. So my first book, After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West, and also my later work on hierarchies in world politics, essentially focus on that. And in the beginning of my career, actually, I kind of bought into the narrative. I mean, the way that like ties in with what I talked about now, I bought into the narrative that this notion of the West had very deep historical legs, and the social hierarchies were there, kind of the Westphalian stuff, like 17th century Westphalia, Ottoman Empire looking in. But actually doing this work for this book made me realize what we call the West and the social hierarchies that attend that concept, the idea that the world is centered in the West, or is a Western creation. That's like actually, I think, late 18th, 19th, 20th century stuff. So we've kind of projected, I think the modern international order is really a creation of the 19th century, and we've projected back into history those present day, relatively recent vintage understandings. Before that, of course, it's not called the West. There is, there are things that are relatively unique about Europe before. What's unique about it, it's very peripheral. So there are these, world orders in Asia, in Eurasia. There's the Persianate world. I mean, so much of the activity until much later in history is outside of Europe. And Europe is relatively peripheral, and it's also parochial, and it's particularly kind of, compared to other parts of the world, it's a bit paranoid, and it polices, belief systems, etc. So, it is kind of a contained entity, and that makes it like unique in some ways. But there isn't, this idea of, supremacy or authority that really, goes back, past, I would say, 18th century. But now, of course, like all the Hollywood historical movies, etc., like so much of, our historical knowledge focuses on European history, that the relative historical importance of various European actors have been really, magnified outside of the modern period. David Smith, an anthropologist I cite in the book, has a really good example. He says, European rulers, let's say in the Middle Ages, who ruled over like 1,000 people, are called kings. And you have, rulers in Africa and other parts of the world that are ruling over hundreds of thousands of people, and they're called chiefs and whatnot. So, right. So it's our understanding of Europe vis-a-vis like the general world history is being completely distorted by that's kind of like a roundabout digression. But in terms of what underwrites European Western authority, I think it really is that what's sometimes called the Great Divergence in 19th century. I mean, that's the other thing. Economically, Europe is not richer or more advanced until the 19th century either. And so much of that comes at the expense of places like, the Indian subcontinent and so on. So it's really building on previous orders, previous riches. And Industrial Revolution, I think, makes a big difference, the military advantage in the 19th century. And then, as I discuss in the book, I'm in my first book, Stigmatization, I get into that in this book as well. So the 19th century non-European, non-Western elites accepting these civilizational hierarchies and then kind of perpetuating them, and I think national national and nationalist curricula later on. It's a very complicated story how like that happened. But as I discuss in this book, I think some of the late 19th century anxieties mapped on with earlier decline debates in the 17th century, even though, Asian states had not declined continuously from the 17th century onwards. So yeah, it's a big question. So much of my work deals with it. I don't have a short answer, but for those who are interested, I also recommend that they look at my earlier work on stigmatization, etc. In terms of differentiation of great houses back then and great houses now. Now, if you talk about great houses that rule the world today, it sounds a bit like it's there's a fine line. One can come across as like a conspiracy theorist, but I do actually agree with you that houses still play a big role. I think we don't notice it as much because something about the way we think about the world has changed. And actually, it's it is a major substantial change. So great houses have always, I think, maybe houses are the major players of history, more than states, more than anything. But what has happened, I think the big shift in modernity is that they became accountable to the regular people, or like it's not a change that only happens in modernity. There are, I think, previous periods. Again, I talked about monotheism, things that increase the agency of every person, decrease the agency of elite actors, right? So, one could say in antiquity, Nietzsche also talks about this, right? There is the regular people don't matter at all, right? They have no value. They're no different than cattle. In places where there are, transcendental belief systems, monotheism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, but also in Asia, other parts like Buddhism, etc., that emphasize the moral agency of every person, or potential moral agency of every person, then human life starts having some value beyond the elites. And then with modernity, there's the idea of citizens and human rights, and so in practice, of course, the elites and the great houses still control so much. But I think in today's world, they can't do it unapologetically, or they have to account for their behavior in a different way. They have to legitimize it in a different way, or they have to hide it, or they have to manufacture consent. Or we talk about democratic accountability, or sometimes populism, right? Like you have to get the regular people on your side in a way that maybe you didn't in the world that I'm talking about or before. And then, is it possible to imagine orders outside of Westphalia? It's possible to imagine them. Well, it's hard because we live in something. It's kind of like, the fish in the ocean. Are they aware of the ocean? Like so much of our world we take for granted, as I was saying, like we think it cannot change. So it's, in that sense, it's difficult to imagine. Some people can. They come up with alternative ways of organizing the world. Many political projects, utopian political projects are about, or utopian or maybe realist. It's about this type of political imagination. I think at this point in 21st century, there's kind of a dearth of imagination. People we know something is wrong. It's hard for us to imagine alternatives to Westphalia or capitalism, which is separate. But one could. But I would say what's difficult is, even if you could imagine alternatives, it's difficult to bring about those alternatives, because so much of historical change depends not on, I think, individual agency, but collective agency, and also like structural factors. I also think things really need to break down for there to be proper replacements. So I think it's very hard to replace order with another order. I think one needs to go order, then long period of disorder. People forget what the old order was like, and then maybe you create something new. I hope that answers your question. I mean, they're big questions. I could talk about them much longer. But, yeah.
Thank you so much. Just one more, and then I will ask Professor Sami to add something to the discussion. So you also talk about this idea of sovereignty, which also interests me a lot. So you talk about this idea in your book that sovereignty is considered to be solely European development, and that international order and sovereignty goes hand in hand, and they cannot exist without each other. Especially we talk about the sovereignty of the modern nation state. So how do you critique this idea of claiming that international order can only exist through the idea of sovereignty, and the sovereignty which is based on the principles on which the nation state is built? So is there a way to critique this idea of sovereignty? Was there a possibility, or was there a sovereignty which existed beyond nation state or beyond Westphalian order? Or how do we conceptualize and critique this idea of sovereignty? How do you look at it?
Yes. Okay, so I mean, so what modern states sovereignty is the building block of the modern international order, and it's characterized, as we teach in introduction classes, by centralization of political authority. So like the Weberian definition would be that the state has monopoly on the legitimate use of force, territory, territoriality, clear borders, external recognition, right? So I mean, there are you can define it different ways, but we kind of all know what the modern state looks like. Now, then scholars look at precursors. Like, we know the modern state is a 19th century creation in the sense, but then scholars of European political thought and history say, well, the defining feature of this is centralization of political authority, and then they debate when this came about in Europe. And then they say, like, sovereignty is a European invention. So my answer to that is, if political centralization is the defining feature of modern sovereignty, well, guess what? Europe was a very late comer to that game. Almost every other region in the world had political centralization before Europe. And if this is the defining feature of sovereignty, then the word cannot be owned by Europe or European history. And it can be used to describe other settings, historical settings. In fact, I mean, I argue in the book that European history, like, Habsburgs play an important role. They try to centralize authority, right? And then they try to exert themselves over the church and other houses in Europe. And then that, provokes, the 30 Years' War, etc. So my argument is that the Habsburgs may not have dared to make these moves had they not been in competition with the Ottomans at the time. And the Ottomans had, under especially Süleyman, and Selim and Süleyman had really centralized rule that was pretty much accountable to nobody, right? So you can trace, if we're talking about influences, you can take it back to Asia. And then, of course, the Mongols, you can take it back, if you go back to the period before my book, you can take it back to earlier Chinese history. So, right, so if this is the thread we're pulling, there's no reason to stop. with European history. So that's kind of an answer to your question. But I mean, the bigger answer is, there have been different forms of sovereignty, and there have been different forms of order. There are international orders, or what I call world orders, with universalizing visions. Then there are others that don't have that universalizing vision, but have their own understanding of sovereignty and governance. Again, we could look at, for instance, the area we call the Middle East from 8th to 10th century. It's a very different understanding of order and rule, divided authority, etc. Right? That would be another setting to study, right? So there are many different forms, and it's just very, I think, very self-centered to assume that the modern version that we have in the 20th century is the only version that people have come up with.
Thank you so much. Now I request Professor Sami, who is the director of Center for Islam and Global Affairs, to offer his insights and add more to this discussion. Thank you so much.
Let me first start by thanking Professor Zarakol for a wonderful presentation and actually great book. I have three interventions that I would like to do in order. One going back more historically, one regarding the present, and one about the future. Historically speaking, I was fascinated by the fact that you started with the 13th century, and I wanted to ask you why the 13th century, why not earlier? Or was it from your perspective, a time where you can actually make your argument more succinct? People in the Islamic world would like to think, and I would like to hear your thoughts about this, that perhaps the Eastern world, or what we call the Islamic world today, probably started its imprint on international relations or in the international history, let's say by the 7th century or so. And then you had different, obviously, dynasties, the Umayyad, the Abbasids, and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect that I would like to hear your thoughts. Or do you think you could go even backward? Backward in history, and try to pull from there and make an argument. But in addition to that, even if you start at the 13th century, someone like Mearsheimer, for example, he starts his theory of international relations based on 5 assumptions and his definition of power. Whether it's military power, population, economic power, and so on and so forth. And also try to have a predictive, and I would like actually defer that question for the future. Is there a predictive value? But having presented his theory, he's trying to draw lessons from the at least recent path. Let's say most of his examples draw from 19th century and forward. I would like to know where, historically speaking, because it's before the West, obviously, what would be the lessons that we could learn from this experience that can make us either understand and hopefully even predict some of the things that happen in our part of the world? Or have we been so much colonized and so much impacted and so much influenced by the West that we actually forgot our history and historical narratives, where these are just historical experiences that don't relate to our modern life, and that we basically play by the rules of the West? Again, I want to thank you for bringing this discipline to where it needs to be, that we really need to go back and research and know and understand and even be impacted and influenced by these historical experiences. After hearing your response, I would like to ask you a couple of more questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So why the 13th century? So I didn't start with the Mongols when the story of the book is I was actually working on sovereignty, and I was trying to conceptualize sovereignty outside of Europe, how it's been understood and practiced. So I was studying both the Ottoman Empire, but also, Islamic history, like trying to understand variations thereof. And then I started encountering in Ottoman historiography arguments that the Ottoman practices changed or underwent a change in 15th, 16th century. And this was, they were demonstrating, certain Mongol influences, particular understanding of, law, particular understanding of, authority. Like, again, debate, there are debates about this, but some of it maybe they brought with them from when they came, but some of it was reasserted after the encounters with, Timur, and then of course, collapse of, the Timurid Empire and the influx of intelligentsia from there. And then it, kind of interested me, and I thought, well, if we can see Mongol influences on the Ottomans so many centuries later, can we see it in other places? And that's kind of the thread that I started pulling backwards. So from the Ottoman trajectory, I went back, and then I came down again to the Mughals, to the Safavids, to Moscow, to China. And I thought the Mongols in 13th century would be a good place to start, because I wanted to write a history of, as I said, of Asia that did not, that was not Eurocentric, but also, I guess I didn't say that, that did not reproduce present day regional divisions. Like, I didn't want to reinforce the way we think about the world now. I wanted us to think about the world a little bit differently. And I thought, if I start with the Mongols, then I can show how all the parts of this continent were at once connected, to the extent that they were influenced by these practices many centuries later. So that's, that was my goal for this book. Of course, one could go back to, 7th century and write about, the way Islam ordered the world. I mean, not only generally the area like around the Mediterranean and modern day Middle East, but again, I learned this as part of writing this book. There were already Muslims in China in 7th century and 8th century, so it spread very quickly across Asia. And of course, this is a connection. This is another way the world is ordered. That would be another book. But for my purposes, I think 13th century is a good starting point. And of course, I'm trying to find examples or orders that are somewhat recognizable to modern day debates in international relations. I mean, one of the difficulties of trying to overcome Eurocentrism in the discipline is it cannot be revolutionary. Like, you have to kind of you have to pull people with you, but if you go too far, they won't come, right? You have to kind of introduce them to something that's different, that they can still think with, using the terms that they're accustomed to, or at least this is my strategy. That's another reason for my choice here. In terms of predictive value, I don't think like Mearsheimer, so I'm not going to be prescriptive. Like, I think it's not a good way to think about history, like to make these very definitive predictions, because I always emphasize structure, but there's a lot of contingency, I think. But I mean, of course, there are lessons. I mean, there are I mean, these lessons about how orders fragment and so on, I discuss in the book. And I think by learning more history, we could also maybe not make definitive predictions, but we could also develop a healthy skepticism about some of the predictions because we have counterexamples. So not so much in my work, but there is the work of David Kang, who works on East Asia in historical IR. And he argues from his work that power transition theory doesn't really apply to Asian history. It's never been, the rules that IR theorists have developed looking at European power competition don't really apply in Asia. And that may be true. I mean, also, as I was saying, Europe is kind of, if we are trying to generalize about history, Europe is more the aberration for many reasons rather than the rule. So it's been particularly problematic, I think, to look at European history and drive general lessons. Now, that brings me to your question. Are we so colonized by the West that we've completely lost touch with that history in a way that it doesn't influence present day dynamics? I think, I mean, again, it's a difficult question. It's I think very complex. So part of what I discovered as a result of my deep dives into history in my career is that some of the things that we associate with the West or Europe, the historical, sociological dynamics that gave rise to those were already underway in the East as well. So they might have happened anyway, maybe slightly differently. So I mean, an example for that is, what we call, nationalization. So the spread of agency from the top to the regular members. That's a process underway pretty much everywhere. I mean, so in European history, that's like, the precursor to that is confessionalization, the creation of national churches and
like millet system. Like
yeah,
the millet.
Yeah. So I mean, millet system. Yeah. So there is also similar processes. Like there's confessionalization in the Ottoman Empire, like Sunnization, and same thing in the Safavid Empire, right? So there is that process. In China, we can discuss, like, it's already like, so maybe something like the nation state would have happened, maybe not exactly the European form. I mean, there are many examples like that. So not everything that we associate with colonization or Western imposition are, I think, entirely alien or foreign. But of course, they're experienced as such, like, which makes it complex, right? So once they become associated as such, then they come to be seen inauthentic, and then people articulate their politics in response to what they consider to be foreign. But so that's why it's complex. And the other, but the other thing is, like, part of writing history is to recover, like, so much has been forgotten, but the echoes, especially sociological echoes, are still reverberating, I think, across these societies. So, maybe, I don't know, Chingizid charisma has been forgotten. Everybody for like centuries was trying to marry into this family, like, it was so powerful across Asia. So that's been forgotten. But other practices, maybe like some of, I don't know, like maybe promotion of trade, right? Certain practices, like, they just kind of are like in the air. And then if you write histories that emphasize these shared experiences or the importance of these practices historically, there's a way of recovering or re-emphasizing them, I think. So again, that's another type of political project, but it is maybe possible to recover what was what was lost, even if it was lost. Okay, so those are my answers. Again, like very big questions that are hard to answer quickly.
Well, thank you very much for answering. The next set of questions have to do with two concepts. One is power, and the other is ideology. Most of modern international relation theorists really are more interested in the nature of power. They define it in a particular way, and of course, they concentrate more when they talk about world order and great powers and great power rivalry. How do you see the dominant dominant dynamics? Is it also about power? Because we know also from the Ottomans and the Safavids, it was mostly also about dominating their region, or at least at the borders. So I wanted to see how you saw that dynamics, and what is and how does power play a role. The second concept, which has to do with ideology. Now, most modern great powers, they would like at least to argue that they represent some sort of a grand idea or ideology, whether it's communism during the or social justice, socialism during the Soviet era, or whether it's the notion of democracy, rule of law, capitalism, open markets, human rights, whatever. They want to use these things just at least to justify their hegemonical policies and their hegemonical presence and how they want to order the world. Was there also a dominant ideology with these Eastern, or this before the West, that also these dynamics, or these dynasties, or these powers, they also tried to project? And did it have to do also with the material world, or was there another aspect to it that most people don't talk about, whether it was spiritual or faith-oriented, faith-based? Because we also read in history a lot, whether it was the Ottomans or prior powers, in which that aspect also was clear in some of their policies. I wanted to see in your study whether you featured or found that, because of course that aspect we don't see in the modern world. So these are two things. And the third one, if you may, also, which has to do with the now we see that the most important ideology that is shaping the world with the nation-state system is nationalism. And you touched upon it when you talked about Confucianism and this and that. Do you think this is the ultimate? Is this the end of history, that this is what people would cling to with the modern international order, or can there be also can we come back to more human type, where nationalism and ethnocentrism and so on and so forth would not carry the day, that we can actually be more human and more towards each other than just the territories that we're in? I wonder if you think that could be a future also.
Thank you. Again, great questions. In terms of power, okay, so yes, I mean, at a minimalist level, like everything is, yes, about power competition. I mean, the realists perhaps are right to say that. And power is a real, material thing. You can see it's exercised, and I'm not, denying any of that. But I think, how power is understood, how it's practiced, always has an ideational dimension. So, one could say the concept of great powers or great power competition, that's an ideational construct that we have that is part of the modern international order. And that's what people are socialized into, and that's how they understand the world. You mentioned, the Ottomans, 16th century. I mean, they also had a concept of, poles, but it was, kutub, so just one pole. Like there wasn't this idea that competition, this is part of, they were competing, but the vision was universal, and there was, there's supposed to be one pole, one, millennial sovereign. So again, the content of how power is exercised is informed by how people see the world and what is right and proper and what order looks like. Symbols of power. Again, we can talk about, material aspects of having nuclear weapons and so on, but they are also, symbols, and different orders have different symbols for power, like a particular cities, conquering Jerusalem, or China, so certain territories are more important than other territories. It's not just the content of the territory, it's the symbolic importance of the territory, right? So there's, I think, always an ideational aspect. And I think the mistake that, realists make, like modern day realists make, is they take a particular moment in time and they think it has always been true. Beyond saying it's all about power, and there would be times where there would be power competitions that they wouldn't even recognize as such, because it would seem like, why are they fighting about this? But in that world, that's what power competition was. And that brings me to the question about ideology. Ideology is a term that has very modern connotations. I think it has to do with, this relates also to your third question, what I said earlier. I think, with modernity, there's been increase of agency and an accountability by the elites, by the state, etc., to the regular people. Even if in practice they don't care, they have to act accountable. They have to be, rulers cannot just say, I'm doing X because that's how I feel. That's what I feel like. I'm doing X because that's what I feel like it. They have to say, I'm doing X for the good of the nation, the good of the people, the good of, our country, So, and I think ideology is part of, how do you manufacture consent or legitimize what you're doing? Ideology is that thing that creates that bridge. And modern ideologies are always in some form, they are validating the individual, like the regular, like the nobody has an importance in modern day ideologies that you mentioned, whether we're talking about communism or nationalism or so on. So they're not elitist. Even when they are elitist, they pretend not to be elitist. So if we go back to pre-modern, if you were, let's say go back all the way to ancient Egypt, if you're the pharaoh, you don't have to say, I'm building the pyramid for the good of the Egyptian people. You can say, I'm a god, that's fine. There is a belief system that surrounds that and makes that possible. It doesn't look like ideology to us because we associate ideology with this catering to the regular people. It's a very interesting question. So, like in the period that I'm looking at, the great houses, Genghis Khan, he actually has to worry about. It's not that he doesn't have to worry about anybody. He has to worry about potential competitors, like other houses that could challenge him, right? So I think there was manufacturing of consent and ideology, but not so much one that touched on the regular people who didn't have any power, but one on the other agents, other houses. And I think that was conquest, so we conquer, we have the heavens mandate, we conquer, and this is our purpose. And this, we have the heavens mandate because we are able to conquer. And then, of course, that then intersects with belief systems, Islam, etc., later on, and becomes absorbs elements from that as well. Yeah, whether that is called ideology, I'm not sure, and I have to think more about that. But definitely belief systems that make this world possible. And finally, yeah, the question about nationalism. Is nationalism the end of history? I don't think so. I don't think there is an end to history. I think certain ideas are very powerful, and then they dominate for a long time. I mean, sometimes centuries, sometimes millennia, and then they the conditions change, the material conditions change, so they no longer work, and they're replaced by other ideas. And then later, another version of that old idea comes back. So for instance, modernity has aspects, what we call modernity, has aspects of antiquity, right? So it's like certain practices of antiquity came back with modernity. And in between there's something else, right? So we keep reinventing certain ideas. So nationalism, I don't know how long it will be around, but it will at some point be replaced with something else. And then maybe it will come back in another form. So yes, I don't know if that.
It does. My last.
Yes, actually, I was told it was
90 minutes. Yes,
so maybe very quickly, but then I have to jump on another call. So
I just want to thank you, and I hope we can host you in Istanbul.
Yes.
One day.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much
for the great questions.
Yes. Very well. Okay, back to you, Mehraj.
Thank you so much, Professor Ayse, for accepting our humble invitation. Inshallah, as Professor Sami said, we would love to host you in Istanbul in our center in future, hopefully, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you once again. Thank you once again.
Yes, thank you. My pleasure.